of you know, a few years back there was a little thing about COVID and museums shutting down along with every other business for a year and a half, something like that. We survived that with no debt and no deficit. We opened, thank you. And every year since then, including 2023, we ended with no debt, no deficit, and we provided more art exhibitions, education, and community programming than before the pandemic. So, that is thanks to three major reasons. One, we have an incredible, albeit small but dedicated staff, and they do a wonderful job. Yeah. We have an energized and active participating board of trustees. And if any of you have ever been with nonprofits before in a board of trustees, you know that for the most part, well, they're not that. But this is a really great board, and they support the mission of the museum. But the biggest factor of why we've done so well is because of you. Our supporters who stepped up every day, every week, every month, coming out to events, participating, donating, giving us ideas, suggestions. So on behalf of the Triton staff, the Triton board, thank you. Thank you. Oh, come on, give yourselves a bigger hand than that. All right, 2 quick announcements before we get started with this month's book, lecture presentation, Portrait of an Unknown Woman. First is, you may have seen something about this, on February 14th, Valentine's Day. I and the board president, John Matthias, are going to be performing weddings here at the museum. That's right. So the idea came about, we know several people that just run down to the courthouse and get married. Well, that can cost you a couple of $100 right there. In fact, I think you have to pay like an extra $15 to get one of their witnesses to stand up from their desk. So this is not a big fundraiser, but for $214, 214, get it? $214, you or someone you know who may be running to the courthouse can come here instead and have a ceremony performed by either me or John Matthias, our board president, in one of the galleries. You and 10 friends, or someone you know and 10 friends, and then you'll be ushered out after a very brief ceremony, and we'll serve you cake and champagne for the 10 or 12 guests. And it's just, okay, it's a marketing thing, right? Because we know the media is going to cover that. And so if anybody's interested, you know, or you know somebody, it's like, you hear somebody, family member, cousin, or oh, you're going to the courthouse? Call the Triton. Get on their schedule, and you can get married here. That'd be great. What a Valentine's Day! Or you can renew your vows.
They would have to go get a certificate.
Oh yes. Oh, if you go online or you call the number that's at the museum here. There's certain things they will have to do. They have to go and get their wedding license and marriage license, all of that. But we'll give all those instructions. Anyway, that's just the first announcement, and that should be fun. The second is I wanted to promote next month's lecture now up front rather than at the end of the lecture where it kind of gets lost. Next month's book is Murder in Mesopotamia. All right, so this is different because this is not about art or an artist. It's about a location. And I love Agatha Christie. So I figured, what better way for me to be able to read another Agatha Christie novel again than to make all of you read it. So this is about the location. The lecture will be about ancient Mesopotamia, where this novel is set. So this is kind of a bubblegum assignment for next month. Enjoy it. As I say, I love Agatha Christie, so that's coming up next month. Now, we're going to look at Portrait of an Unknown Woman by Vanora Bennett. It's really about the art of Hans Holbein the Younger. So Hans Holbein the Younger was an English Renaissance artist. The Renaissance in England was about a generation or so after the Renaissance in Italy. Of course, it starts in Italy and then it diffused out throughout the continent. So the High Renaissance is what we're really talking about. The early Renaissance had been going on for some time, but the High Renaissance, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and then outside of Italy you had Dürer, and in England you had Hans Holbein. So this is who we're going to be looking at. This is the era of Henry VIII, the Tudors. And so we're going to look at Hans Holbein, and we'll start with the early years. And as I look at that, I realize I should have called it the younger years. Yeah, missed opportunity. This is Hans. This is his self-portrait, and this is in the year that he died, just shortly before he died in 1543. He was from Germany, so he was a transplant into England, but he carried with him a lot of humanist and Renaissance ideas that would inform not only English art, but English society and the history that would follow. Here's a double portrait by Hans Holbein the Elder, his father. This is Hans on the right and his brother Ambrosius on the left. And both boys were trained in the father's studio. They were both very gifted artists. Ambrosius died as a very young man, probably of plague, not entirely certain on that. But this is the father's portrait of his two sons and his two chief apprentices, if you will. The father was not what you would call a high Renaissance artist. He was definitely an early Renaissance artist with one foot still very firmly planted in the medieval art that preceded the Renaissance. Here is a detail of a much larger painting by Hans Holbein the Elder, and that's his self-portrait up there, and the portraits of his two sons, who look oddly minuscule. But that's a carryover of the medieval tradition, where there was still what they call a hierarchical perspective. That is, the perspective is not visual. The perspective is who's more important. Papa Holbein was more important than the two boys. So not only are they drawn as children or young men, they're drawn at a physically smaller scale. Now, if Hans Holbein the Elder was standing next to one of the saints that was in the same panel, the saints would tower over him. That's called hierarchical perspective. That gets lost in the Renaissance, where we start having a devotion to reality, realism. So Hans Holbein grows up with this influence and teaching from his father, but he's very heavily influenced by the Renaissance ideas that are filtering into Germany at the time. And the leading proponent of this adoption of Renaissance realism is Albrecht Dürer. And Dürer was just phenomenal. He was very influenced by Leonardo. We know that Hans Holbein the Younger was also influenced by Leonardo. We know that he traveled to Italy. We know that he studied there. We don't know exactly when. There's a lot of details that we do not know, but we do know that he was heavily influenced by paintings of Leonardo. And here's one of Leonardo's paintings that we believe Hans Holbein actually saw and was quite influenced by. Here's probably one of the earliest works we have by Holbein, by Hans the Younger. This is a drawing in the margins of a book called In Praise of Folly by the great humanist philosopher Erasmus. Now, Erasmus was famous throughout Europe. He was highly influential for his philosophical ideas, for the ideas of humanism, the idea that humanity has value, which is another anti-medieval idea. The idea that humans actually mattered. This is a rebirth, a renaissance of classical ideas. In ancient Greece, at the Oracle of Delphi, there is inscribed above the cave that leads into this cave-like temple, the inscription that in translation says, man is the measure of all things. In other words, we are the important thing. Yes, there were gods. Yes, there were saints. But we are worthy in and of ourselves. That idea was lost during the medieval era. It was recaptured and re-promoted by the humanists and the Renaissance artists in the Renaissance era. So Hans Holbein knew a scholar who had a copy of Erasmus's book, and he was invited to draw illustrations in the margins, which was a very common practice. So we have this little pen and ink drawing up in the upper right corner. Now, much to our benefit, Hans the Younger met Erasmus, and they became very close friends. This is one scholar, Bonifacius Amerbach, who was a humanist, and he engineered the meeting between Hans Holbein the Younger and Erasmus. And there's the scholar himself, Portrait of Erasmus of Rotterdam by Hans Holbein the Younger, 1523. Now this is before he went to England. But it was Erasmus who told Hans Holbein the Younger, your future lies in England. You need to go there. There's a king in England that you need to meet. That king was Henry VIII. Henry VIII was, at this time, not the bloated tyrant that we've come to know and love from history. He was Henry VIII. In fact, I was just talking to Vanessa in the back. We were talking about Henry. In his younger years, he was young, athletic, incredibly handsome, a gifted musician, very devout in his faith. You would never have guessed that he would be the one to break with the Roman Church. In fact, he was given the title by the Pope, Defender of the Faith, because he wrote treatises and pamphlets defending the Catholic Church against that new upstart Protestantism. So he decided that he would go to England. And there he was going to meet this young humanist king as introduced by Erasmus. Now, before he got to England, as most artists, especially outside of England at this time, were doing, he did a lot of religious works. That was the bread and butter of an artist. It was the church who was buying most of the paintings, and if not the church, it was somebody who was purchasing it for the church in order to, buy some kind of indulgence or make a gift to the church so they would get some kind of spiritual reward back. Well, his paintings were a little bit out of the ordinary for religious paintings. This is the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. Safe to say it's not a painting you'd want above your dining room table. It's harsh. It's painfully realistic. It shows the emaciated body. It shows the body in hues of decay. It's just a very difficult piece. But this was in the German tradition, in the German early Renaissance tradition that he had learned from his father and from his predecessors. One of his predecessors in the Northern European tradition, Matthias Grunwald, the crucifixion. And here you don't see Christ on the cross, where yes, you look at the Renaissance paintings of Christ on the cross, and yes, he's crucified, but you don't see the torment physically. You don't see the body rotting as you do in Grunwald's painting. And here Grunwald has the lamentation. And it's the same kind of a feeling that you get from Hans Holbein's painting of just this, not just loss of physical life, not just the spiritual trauma, but just the actual physical decay that comes along with all of that. Well, this, as I say, was a tradition. It was adopted in early Renaissance Italian paintings. This is by Masaccio. It's a smallish fresco. And in the bottom of the fresco, you have what was a medieval and then early Renaissance tradition that Hans Holbein was also copying, this skeleton, which is called a memento mori. A memento mori is to remember one's mortality, to remember that we're all going to die. Get your things in order. That's what these were for, is to say, here's your warning. And above this skeleton in a tomb, over which is the Holy Trinity, above the skeleton is written in translation, essentially, as you are, I once was. As I am, you will become. Wow, talk about being hit over the head when you walk into this cathedral and see this. So that's the tradition that Hans Holbein started out in, painting these memento moris. And here you have the skeleton, the vanitas, which is another term for this type of painting. And you have him reading a book, not just any book, he's reading a book by a humanist scholar. So even humanism won't save you from that ultimate fate. That's a very Northern European style, very Northern European tradition. It was very heavy. It was very instructive, almost berating people to respect the faith. Hans Holbein did several things. He did a whole series from the Dance of Death series, or the Dance Macabre, and here you have an abbot who's being led probably down to hell by a skeleton, and they would have whole series of these prints. So you'd have an abbot being led, you'd have a king being led, you'd have a princess being led, you'd have a bishop or a pope, all being led by these skeletons because they just did not measure up. So again, it's very, just hit you over the head with it. He did a lot more traditional religious paintings. This is Noli me tangere, Do Not Touch Me, which was from the incident after the resurrection when the resurrected Jesus meets with Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and he says, "Don't touch me, I have not ascended yet." So very illustrative type of religious works. And he did, as all artists did, the commissions for donors. So it was a tradition coming out of the medieval era and right through the Renaissance that if you were a private donor, you wanted to make a gift to the church, you might have an altarpiece done, or maybe in your home, you would want an altarpiece in your home. In this case, the Madonna and Child. And who are all of these people? They're the ones that paid for the painting. Because of course you'd want to have your own portrait put in the painting, wouldn't you? That way everybody that sees it would know, oh, what a sacred and faithful servant so-and-so is. Look at him. He's got his hands. My goodness, isn't he a good man? He's praying 24/7. Okay? And that was, we can laugh and we can be cynical about it. But keep in mind, in that time and age, that's what they believed. That was legitimate. That was not cynicism. That's just the way it was. And so he did a lot of paintings in that nature. And then he did some others that were a little more pointed. In this case, you have the humiliation of the Emperor Valerian by the Persian king Shapur. So Valerian was an ancient Roman emperor who was the only emperor actually captured in battle. And he was humiliated by this Persian king Shapur. And here is Valerian down here on his hands and knees while Shapur uses him as a footstool to climb up onto his horse. Okay, well, that's bad enough. The real humiliation that came when, because of Valerian's greed, Shapur poured molten gold down his throat and killed him. So if any of you ever remember watching Game of Thrones, they pull that scene in one of their episodes. So anyway, this is a commentary on kingship, a commentary on power and how power can corrupt, and the ultimate, the end of what happens after power corrupts. So moralistic. And Holbein could be, especially in his younger years, quite moralistic in his paintings. Then he goes to England. As I say, it was engineered and introduced by Erasmus. He goes to England, and right off the bat, he's the best artist in England. So, of course, he becomes a court painter. And in England, he starts becoming renowned for introducing what are some of the most realistic Renaissance portraits that England had ever seen. So he was an immediate smash hit. This is his painting of Laius of Corinth. Laius of Corinth was an ancient Greek, Roman courtesan. She was a prostitute. And she was very famous from that era, during the era of Pericles. It's believed that she may have been an occasional mistress and courtesan of Pericles. So she was a famous person, but this happens to also be a real person, the person who is posing for this, and that is Hans Holbein's mistress. Hans Holbein had a wife and 2 kids that he left behind in Germany for this trip to England, and he took up house with this young lady, and here she is again in Venus and Amor. So you have Venus and a little Cupid, which happens to be Hans Holbein's son, and Cupid's holding his little arrow down there. So he had this kind of dual life. This too was not uncommon at the time. So here we have a totally new type of painting being introduced into England. And I can't stress enough how seismic this introduction was, because it changed everything. Oh, a note about Laius of Corinth. It is said that she was also the courtesan and mistress of an artist of the Periclean era named Apelles. And Apelles was traditionally known as the most or the greatest painter in ancient Greece. Now, we don't have very many or any paintings of Apelles. It's all by reputation. What we do have is a first century mosaic reproduction of a painting by Apelles. And this is, over here you have Alexander the Great fighting one of his many conquests and battles. So Apelles, being the greatest artist of ancient Greece, that became the nickname for Hans Holbein the Younger in England. They said, oh, Apelles reborn. He's bringing classical Greece back to us. He's bringing great paintings back. And that's why She, as Laius, as the mistress of Apelles, the mistress of Hans Holbein. It was all a big wordplay, wink, wink, nod, nod. Isn't this fun? But really what this was about was marketing. Because he would take these paintings, which were his, they weren't done for anybody else, and he would say, here's what I can do. You want to see silk fabrics painted? You want to see jewels painted? You want to see tapestries painted, skin tones? And he was also using the new painting techniques, oil paints. Before his time, everybody was using tempera, which is a mixture of pigment and egg whites, and it would harden. It's like an opaque watercolor, or let's call it an egg color. And it's unforgiving, it's flat, it's not translucent at all. Oil paints you can thin down till it's very translucent. You can do layer upon layer and give it a build up color and make the skin tones actually look like there might be blood coursing beneath. So this was his marketing tool right here. Well, it wasn't long before every notable in England was clamoring at Hans Holbein the Younger's door to get their portrait painting. None more so than his sponsor in England, again arranged through Erasmus, of Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More was a chief advisor of Henry VIII. He was an ecclesiastic. He was the one that Henry had problems with him. He relied on Thomas more than anyone in a spiritual sense. But ultimately they would have a break. And we'll get to that a little bit later. In the meantime, it was enough that Thomas More was the most respected scholar in all of England. Nobody had a higher, more polished reputation, nor did anybody deserve a higher or more polished reputation. Thomas More was a genuinely good man in an era where corruption was rife. He was a kind man. He was a brilliant scholar. Just everything good you can say about him was probably true. So he was highly regarded. He was a good family man. And this is part of the story of the novel. There were portraits of Thomas More's family that Hans Holbein executed. And in this, it's not just a current family. This is a sketch of Holbein's painting of Thomas More's family. The original painting is gone. All we have from Holbein is the sketch, but we do have copies of the original painting, or let's say interpretations of the original painting. So here we have Thomas More seated with his father, with his descendants, with other ancestors. It's kind of a mishmash of people that Thomas More just wanted in the painting. Now here is one of the reproductions done many years later. It was commissioned by Thomas More's grandson. And here we have the other reproduction. All they had to go on, presumably, was the sketch. Maybe for the first one, there was still the original painting. We don't know. Now, in the novel, it deals with Thomas More's children. He had a foster daughter as well, and she's part of the subject of the book. But like most historical novels, you get a lot of really great history, but there's a lot of made-up stuff as well. So the author took these portraits, these group portraits, family portraits, and wove a story around them. I applaud that, but I never mistake that for the history, because sometimes the best parts of history is what we don't know, because that excites the mind. It makes you want to learn more. Maybe you'll be the one to find the next clue, the next piece of the puzzle. So these are the portraits that inspired the book. This is his eldest daughter, Thomas More's eldest daughter, Margaret Roper. This is done in 1535, and it's a miniature. Miniatures are fairly small, And they were painted to be worn as a pendant or a locket or carried with them. This is another bit of bread and butter for the artists. They were done quickly, they were done cheaply, they weren't on canvas or wood, they were done on vellum, they were done with gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, so it doesn't have the same translucent quality of watercolor. But artists love to have these done, and the inscription is etatis 30, at the age of 30. So here we have Thomas More's daughter after, I believe, he had been executed. Here is the figure that, the young woman that figures prominently in the book. This is Margaret Giggs, Thomas More's foster daughter. She was one of the great intellects of her time, despite being a woman. She obviously didn't have the same opportunities, but Thomas More made sure that she did, and she was one of the great mathematicians of the day. Thomas More made sure she did have the opportunities. In fact, when Thomas More died, when he was in the Tower of London, he carried with him a little talisman that was all in algebra that she had created. And so he treasured that right up to the very end. This is, by the way, is just a sketch for a painting. We don't have the painting anymore. We have several painting sketches that he did. Here's just a portrait of a lady with a squirrel and a starling. We don't know who the lady is. We do know that the squirrel is a symbol of industriousness, of caution, of preparedness. And the starling is a symbol of newness, of rebirth, of a new life, because they would be the first birds to return after winter. And so somehow these two symbols, the squirrel and the starling, were added to this anonymous lady, anonymous to us, to tell us that she was a noteworthy woman. She was a woman that's going to give new life. Are we to read into that she was the bride of the person commissioning this painting? Perhaps. We just don't know, but it's still a very striking portrait of a woman. Oh, the other thing I want you to notice, there's no flattery going on. Holbein was known for accuracy. He wanted to be accurate, warts and all. He didn't want to flatter the sitter. That was something for kings, not for the common sitter. And he became known for his skill, and actually very much appreciated for this. If you think about the medieval style paintings that preceded Hans Holbein, especially in England, they were blocky, they were flat, they were awkward, they didn't even look like the person most of the time. So this was really quite revolutionary. After his couple of years, excuse me, in England, he goes back to Basel, where he has now an international reputation. Wow, talk about not flattering the sitters. This is his portrait of the artist family, his wife and his two children, at what's gonna be the worst Thanksgiving ever. Again, no flattery. We know that Hans Holbein did not care all that much for his wife. We know that she did not care all that much for her husband. And those poor kids just look like they've already given up. No flattery there. What are we reading? Are we reading their true appearance? Probably. Are we definitely reading Hans Holbein's psychological response to how he feels about his family? I'll leave that the professionals here. Well, you could make a whole thesis out of this, this painting. Okay, so realism can be a double-edged sword. He went back to painting some of his religious paintings because in Germany that's what was selling. And so he did an allegory of the Old and New Testaments. And you have just a mishmash of all these different episodes from Adam and Eve to the emergence from the tomb. He had enough of Germany. He liked England. In England, he was a superstar. In England, his Renaissance realism was appreciated. In England, his wife and kids weren't there. So he went back and he became the official court painter. He went to painting all of the notables. This is Thomas Eliot, who was a diplomat and an ambassador to the king at different times. Again, this is just a study for the ultimate painting, which we don't have. This is Lady Eliot. Notice, I like this. Notice on the inscription up there, it says the Lady Eliot, E-L-I-O-T, and here E-L-Y-O-T. That's because the Y-O-T spelling is how the family spelled the name. The I-O-T spelling is how Hans Holbein just spelled it. There was no faithfulness to spelling anybody's name the same way twice. And you'll find people writing their own name with different spellings. It just wasn't a big issue. It's, oh, this is what it sounds like. This is how I'm going to write it today. Here we go. This is a more refined painting than one of his sketches. Here we have a merchant, George Geese, a very wealthy young man who had all of these different elements added in. You have symbols of wealth. You have symbols of his business. You have little memento mori, such as this quill hanging partway off the table. And whenever you see that, by the way, this is a really good, this goes into the Baroque era. When you see a still life and things are hanging halfway off the table, that's a symbol of the precariousness of life. So he's a wealthy young man. He's at the height of his powers. He's at the height of his career. But that thing could fall off the table at any minute. You could walk out of this museum and get hit by a bus. You're not going to get hit by a bus. But that's what the symbol meant. And you would have a glass, or in this case, a vase, and the flowers. One flower is dead. Because again, you might be in full bloom of life, but who knows what's to come? We all know. So Holbein never completely abandoned that moralizing that he carried over from his earlier Germanic paintings. Talk about loaded with symbols. This is probably one of Holbein's most famous paintings. It's called The Ambassadors. It was commissioned by Anne Boleyn, who was at the time wooing the king. And in this case, you have two French ambassadors, and they had come to England to debate with Henry and with some of his scholars the divisions in religion. Henry had not broken from the church yet. Anne Boleyn was an only partially secret Protestant. Henry knew that. So she had persuaded him to invite these Catholic scholars to discuss the divisions in religion going on. Again, the breakaway from the Catholic Church hadn't happened yet. So here you have the two ambassadors, which are incredible portraits in and of themselves, but it's loaded with symbolism about religion. On the top shelf are all kinds of scientific instruments dealing with the sky. So you have a terrestrial globe, you have instruments for plotting the stars, you have instruments for gauging the angle of the sun. All of these were symbolic of the mechanisms of heaven. On the lower table, you have a terrestrial globe. You have a humanist book by Erasmus. You have a lute, which was a symbol of sexuality, human, earthly, lust, and sexuality. So you have the heavens, you have the earth, and then down below, you have this. And if you were to tilt the painting so that you would see it at an oblique angle, that's what it looks like. A memento mori, another of Holbein's skeletons or skulls. Remember, you two young scholars, full of yourselves, you're coming here and you're debating the tenets of the Roman Church. But while you do that, understand that humanism by Erasmus is taking hold, that Protestant ideals are taking hold. And where's that crucifix that is so important in the Roman Church? It's up there, hidden by the curtain, just barely peeking out. Now, Holbein was a Catholic. That's what he was raised as. He never abandoned that. But when the England did break away from the Roman Church, Holbein said, okay. And he painted whatever they wanted him to paint. It wasn't an issue for him. So this was an incredibly loaded painting, and scholars are still debating what all of the various symbols mean. But still, it's an incredible feat to do that. Here's one of his more traditional portraits. This is Charles de Solier, who was a French ambassador to England. So even people coming out of other countries, when they were there in London, they would want Holbein to do the painting, do the portrait of them. It's a marvelous portrait. This is not by Holbein. This is the meeting of Sir Thomas More with his daughter after his sentence of death in 1535. So, what happened? Thomas More was Holbein's sponsor, the most respected man in all of England. Well, what happened was Henry wanted a divorce. He was married to Catherine of Aragon. Let me see, do I have here? Yeah. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was originally married to his older brother, Arthur, who died very young, and Henry then became the heir to the throne. As was tradition, Henry married the betrothed wife of Arthur, who was, do I have here? Catherine of Aragon. And here she is as a young woman. So Henry married Catherine of Aragon. They had a daughter named Mary. They had several other kids that were stillborn. He never had a male heir. After a while, Henry decided that he wanted somebody who could give him a male heir. And that someone was going to be Anne Boleyn. So here's a later portrait from a miniature of Catherine of Aragon in 1525. This is before the divorce. And there's their daughter, all grown up, Mary Tudor, from whom we get that wonderful phrase or expression, Bloody Mary. She was indeed ruthless. But now we're in the time of Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was married Henry in 1533, but she had been courting him and teasing him for 10 years. She would not agree to marry him until he was fully divorced. I should say she would not allow Henry to consummate their relationship until he was divorced. And once the divorce was underway, then everything transpired. This is a portrait of Anne Boleyn. It's done years after, but it was probably done from another original painting. So we have a good sense of what she looked like, not by Hans Holbein. Holbein probably did do paintings of Anne Boleyn. He almost certainly did, and they would have been destroyed after Anne Boleyn's downfall. So what happened with Sir Thomas More? Well, Henry he desperately wanted a divorce, but he had trouble getting a divorce because his current wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the aunt of the Emperor of Spain, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in all of Europe, with the biggest army. Nobody wanted to go against the emperor, not even the Pope. And the Pope sided with the emperor time after time after time and told Henry, no, you can't have a divorce. It's not going to happen. Finally, after 10 years of frustration, Henry is persuaded by Anne Boleyn and by her camp to just break away from the church. They said, after all, you're the king. And shouldn't the king be the head of the Church of England? And so Henry became the least Protestant in all of England. He was still Catholic to the core, but he agreed to break from the Pope. And of course, the Pope excommunicates him. And in order to justify his new position, he ordered that everybody of power had to sign a proclamation stating that he was now the head of the Church of England. And this did not go over well with Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More said, no, I can't, in good faith, I cannot do it. I will not oppose you. I will not speak out against you. But I can't sign your paper. And so he was convicted of malicious silence. Think about that, malicious silence. There's a few people I would like to have malicious silence about, but so anyway, this happens. Thomas More is put to death. And by this time, Hans Holbein the Younger is so well established as the court painter, and he's so malleable and willing to say, I'll paint whoever, that it just, he just keeps on going. By the way, this, in an interesting irony, this is the Pope who refused the divorce and also excommunicated Henry VIII when he broke from the church. And this is Clement VII. Clement VII is the nephew of Lorenzo de' Medici. So you had the great Lorenzo the Magnificent, the mastermind behind the Italian Renaissance. And so we're talking about a generation later. And before Clement became Pope, his cousin, Leonardo's son, Leo X, was Pope and nearly bankrupted the church because he decided, well, if I'm Pope, I'm going to have a party. And that's all he did. And he just, he was one of the leading causes for the Reformation and for the Protestants breaking away because he was so damn corrupt. And so here you have a Pope who was born and raised and trained in the Renaissance and humanist traditions, who is now on the side of denying the very people who are saying, but wait a minute, humanism, Protestantism. It was just an interesting conflict of characters that he, of all people, a Medici, would be the one that would first deny this innovation in England, but then became the one that really projected the Renaissance in England. It's just, they were just so convoluted and intermixed. I mentioned that Anne Boleyn was now the wife. Very short-term wife. Long-term relationship, short-term wife. This is their daughter, Elizabeth I, who after Henry's son, who was born later, after Mary, then Elizabeth I becomes the queen. Wife number 3. Because now Henry's looking for an heir. And Anne Boleyn was not suitable. She did have a child, potentially could have had another child, but she was also the victim of a lot of malicious gossiping and rumors. It's still debated whether Anne Boleyn did the things that she was accused of. It's quite possible, but nobody has the definitive answer. The bottom line is she pissed off the king. And when you do that, you lose your head. And that's what happened to Anne. So the king, by this time, he had already become dissatisfied with Anne. He takes up with Jane Seymour in 1536. They are married. Jane Seymour is pictured everywhere. Here's a painting by Holbein. This is actually a reproduction of a mural that Holbein did in a palace. And here you have Henry VIII with his father, Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, and there's Jane Seymour, wife number 3. And Jane does indeed conceive and have a son. Here's Holbein's portrait of Jane Seymour. By all accounts, this was a very good match. For once, this was a very good match. Henry was truly in love with her. She had an heir, so that took that issue off the table. This is the baby that they had, portrait of Edward VI, 1538. It's an interesting portrait because this is a little toddler, and yet he has a very adult kind of persona and demeanor. But he was the king, the future king, the king to be. Sadly, he did not get to enjoy that very long. He died as a young man, a boy, a teenager. During this time, if you were a court painter, that meant that you got every semi-artistic assignment around. So the king wants a new fireplace in one of his palaces. Hans, design me a fireplace. Well, there it is. That's one of the fireplaces that Hans Holbein the Younger designed for a chimney piece. You want something for the dinner table? How about this? Hans, I need something to keep people interested at the dinner table. Make me a clock salt. Now, I know what you're all asking yourselves right now. What the hell is a clock salt? A clock salt, here, this is Hans Holbein's version. Here's another version that was made. A clock salt combined two things for the dinner table. A newfangled clock, which was just a mechanical wonder. This was amazing. Clocks were not everywhere. To have a clock on the table? That's remarkable. But it needs to be useful as well, because remember, nobody ever had to tell the time before this. So it was just kind of an oddity. So why would you put it on the table? I know. Let's at the very top put a salt cellar. Yeah. So you need some salt? Pass the salt. Oh, what time is it? Isn't that a great invention? Now, we have to look back in history and realize, this is a time when people would sit around the table, and because they didn't want to talk to each other, they would look at this mechanical marvel rather than talk to their fellow diners. I mean, thank goodness we don't do that anymore. Yeah. Well, okay. The more things change, the more they stay the same. All right. Well, now we get to some of the big portraiture that Hans Holbein did of Henry VIII. And, I mean, What a striking figure. You know, by this time, he is growing more and more corpulent. As a young man, he was athletic, he was handsome, he was erudite, he was highly intelligent, he was a gifted musician. It's believed, debated, that he wrote the song Greensleeves. I mean, he was really quite talented. He was a poet, he was a scholar, super athletic. He wasn't the prince that everybody else let win. He genuinely did win. And then he had an accident, and he was in a jousting accident. His leg was severely wounded. It was a wound that for the rest of his life did not heal. And we were talking about earlier, Vanessa and I were talking, how would they deal with it? Well, they didn't have penicillin. They didn't have antibiotics. What would they do? They would have maggots eat out the corrupted flesh, but this went on for decades with this wound. By the end of his life, when the wound was completely festered and still open, people couldn't be in the same room as him because it smelled so bad. So that's why he started putting on weight. He was constantly in bed. He was constantly eating. That was, this is kind of the era that he's going through all of that. Now, the other thing about this is when he had this and several other portraits like this painted, he insisted that they show his legs. I know. Because to have powerful legs was a symbol of being a powerful king. Early on, when he had sent his ambassadors to France to parley with Francis I over some treaty they were engineering, when his ambassadors came back, and we have documentation of the conversations, they wrote everything down. When the ambassadors came back, Henry said, "First, tell me, how are his legs?" And the ambassadors, immediately knew what was going on. "Oh, he has powerful legs, sire. He has the legs of a king, legs you could respect." And Henry responded, "More powerful than mine?" "Oh no, Your Highness. You have the most powerful legs in all of Christendom. Your legs are magnificent." Now, why would this be a thing? Because this is another carryover from medieval traditions. If you rode into battle and you were holding on to the reins of your horse and you were to wield a sword, your arms are pretty much occupied. But if you're a king, you could have two weapons, and you would steer the horse entirely with your massive, powerful, kingly legs. That took incredible strength, incredible skill. So to have powerful legs meant you were a powerful king. And there they are. Now you'll never look at a king's legs the same way again. Yeah. All right, well, his wife, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth. So that was his great love, and he held on to that flame for the rest of his life. But he did need to marry again. He was still looking for another male heir. What do they say? An heir and a spare? Seems like we've been hearing something about that lately. So he was looking for a new bride, and she came in the form of Anne of Cleves. Now, Holbein was sent out to scope out potential brides. Because of his devotion to realism, Holbein's job was to go and paint portraits of the candidates. And the first candidate that he was sent to paint a portrait of was Princess Christine of Denmark. And here she is, aged about 16, I believe I recall. Sweet young lady, but Henry was not impressed because she was not smart. She was uneducated. She couldn't read. And anybody that's with him has to be able to read. Who else is going to appreciate his poetry, right? So he put the nix on that, and then Holbein was sent to paint Anne of Cleves. Now, this became an issue. Henry grudgingly agreed to marry Anne of Cleves for political reasons. It was a good alliance. But he was not impressed with her scholarship abilities, which were lacking. And he insisted that she was not attractive. Well, she's not unattractive. She's a lovely young lady. Holbein painted her that way. He painted her several times. Was she the raving beauty that Anne Boleyn was reputed to have been? Probably not. Was Henry just being a jerk? Probably. But then matters got worse. He goes to meet Anne Boleyn while she's being escorted back to England for the marriage, and Henry decides he's going to play a trick on her. And he gets with all of his buddies, and they pull into the tavern, the inn where the princess and her entourage are staying, and they all meet up. They say, oh, we're here from the king, and Henry's in disguise. He's not dressed as the king, and he's unimpressed. He doesn't like talking to her. He doesn't like how she looks. And let's just say that her bathing habits were less than occasional. So she smelled poorly, according to Henry. He ends up revealing himself. They spend the evening together, and it was a disaster. They get married. And on the wedding night, Henry comes in and says, good night. And he leaves. They never consummated it. Finally, Henry, this went on and on. Finally, Henry just said, that's it. I'm not doing this. Because by now, he was the King of England. He was the head of the Church of England. He had already divorced one wife, lost or killed the second wife, and lost the third. And he said, no, I'm going to get what I want. And so, because the relationship was not consummated, they had an annulment. A divorce is what they called it back then, but it was an annulment. And he sets her up in a palace. Because she was a former queen, he gives her an incredible income. And she becomes a celebrity in England. Because despite the negative feelings that Henry had towards her, he finally gives her the title of his sister. Because despite everything else, he learns that she's a genuinely nice person. Everybody loved her. And so she escaped the horrible torment of being married to Henry VIII, ends up being given a palace, an incredible income, becoming one of the most revered and beloved women in all of England, and she outlived them all. So, well done, Anne of Cleves. She really dodged a bullet. Here's a later portrait that Holbein done after the annulment in the early 1540s. Who knows why Henry was so adamant against her, but good for her. It would not have ended well. I think we can all agree on that. And here's Anne of Cleves, again in the 40s, by another artist, just to show kind of the similarities of what she did indeed look like. Then we get to the last years of Hans Holbein the Younger, 1540 to 1543. By now, his role as being sent out as a portrait ambassador to bring in images for the king to ponder who's the next wife going to be. You know, now he's stationed well in England. He's approached by everybody to do portraits. Here is a miniature of Jane Small, who is the wife of a court diplomat. And again, these miniatures were very small. He did just hundreds of them. This is what it would have looked like in its pendant, or what it does look like. Here are miniatures that he did of two boys, Henry Brandon and Charles Brandon, who were members of the Duke of Suffolk's family. And then he continued to do portraits of Henry. This is Henry at the age of 49. He's really becoming more and more bedridden at the time. He marries again, wife number 5. In 1540, he marries Catherine Howard, who was in every way unfit to be a queen. She did not have the word discretion at all floating around in her head. So while it was entirely appropriate and proper for kings to have mistresses, it's not appropriate and appropriate, or proper for a queen to have suitors other than the king. And so she pretty much ensured her fate, which was the same as Anne Boleyn. She was beheaded. And there is Catherine Howard, one of the miniatures by Holbein the Younger. Not another poor match. And then in 1540, he marries Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr was the widow of another wealthy individual. She was past childbearing years. Henry knew that, so was he. He had kind of given up on that pipe dream. By this time, he wanted a nurse, and apparently she could stand the smell. So he married Catherine Parr. She was well regarded by everybody. She was a very good match for him, and he died. So, she outlived him. There's that. And here's Catherine Parr by another artist, William Scrotts. Well, if you want to keep track of your Henry VIII brides, remember the little ditty: divorced, beheaded, died; divorced, beheaded, survived. And that tells you everything you need to know about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. In his very last years, Henry continued to do court portraits. This is John Chambers, the physician to King Henry VIII. And this is 1543. And then we have Hans Holbein the Younger, his self-portrait that we started with in 1543, just shortly before he died. And we believe that he died of the plague. Circumstances would indicate that. That's it. That's the life of Holbein. But what happened afterwards? Holbein brought the High Renaissance into England a generation and a half after it flourished in Florence and then Rome. And because he brought this to England, and because he gave a visual vocabulary to humanism, that had the most powerful influence on the most celebrated Englishman of that time to follow, William Shakespeare. Without Hans Holbein's introduction of this incredibly faithful realism, what we would call an introspection, an inward looking, a psychologically piercing realism in his portraiture, without that, William Shakespeare would never have been able to create his great works, the culmination of which was Hamlet, the most inward-looking individual in all of literature. And now, just look at all of these, are Hamlets that were performed. It's constantly performed. These are just some of the film versions that we have. So this is what we have to thank Hans Holbein for. You don't usually think of that, but this is the 500th anniversary of the printing of the first folio, the first collection of Shakespeare's works. We wouldn't have that without Hans Holbein. So, thank you, Hans. You inspire the world. See you all next month, and Happy New Year.